Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
As we all continue to process last week's election results, I was grateful to be joined today by Dr. Ruy Teixeira, influential political analyst, demographer, and commentator. Perhaps best known for his critically acclaimed book, The Emerging Democratic Majority, Ruy is co-editor of the Liberal Patriot blog on Substack and the author of the more recent book, which proved to be pretty prescient, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. Today, Ruy and I talk about, in his words, the shattering of the Democratic coalition, walking through the loss of working class voters, a shift that Ruy argues has been underway for some time. He points to concerns about affordability, immigration, and identity politics as key drivers to last week's outcome, as well as about how voters could have such wildly different impressions of Donald Trump. Finally, we talk about what Republicans would need to do to consolidate their gains into a bona fide realignment, or what Democrats can do to win those voters back. As we all continue to think, talk, and importantly, listen to each other about what happened last week and where we go from here, I hope this conversation is food for thought. Enjoy. Ruy Teixeira, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I have really been looking forward to our conversation as much as I can, because this is probably going to be a little bit of a painful conversation, but I've been looking forward to hearing from you since last week, and really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's definitely a shock to the system what happened on November 5th, but there were signs before that it's a real possibility.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. And I'm interested I'd love to hear more about the shock, because I know that you, of all people, have been writing for a very long time about, the trouble Democrats have been having increasingly with working class white voters in particular. It feels like we eroded even more working class non-white voters this time around. So I know. Right. I've been reading your analysis. I thought your shattering of the Democratic coalition was a really important piece. If people haven't read that, I really encourage them to do so. But tell me I'm interested to know that you were shocked, and tell me kind of what your takeaway is.
Well, when I say, I meant more like it was a shock to the democratic system. It wasn't that much of a shock to me in the sense that I did, to some extent, see this coming. I guess I was somewhat surprised at the extent of the shifts that took place. That it was pretty uniform across the country. It was particularly bad among some of the groups that the Democrats most rely upon. A lot of things that were supposed to happen didn't, like young women moving toward the Democrats to defend abortion rights. I mean, there are a lot of things that were like, I suspected it might be bad for the Democrats. It was just worse than I was guessing. So in that sense, it was a surprise, but not completely a shock. But I think it did come as a shock to a lot of Democrats, because I think that if you were paying attention to the polling data that were being collected over the course of this cycle, it was pretty clear that despite how close it was, that the Democrats were continuing to lose altitude among non-white voters, particularly Hispanics, that they were definitely going to lose another substantial chunk of their working class support. They were doing, as usual, terribly, and even worse among white working class voters. But, back to what you were mentioning, the non-white working class, really, really running below what Biden did in 2020. It looked like 15 or 20 margin points worse than he did. So we did have signals from the polling data, but I think the attitude of most Democrats was, I can't possibly be right. We can't possibly be only carrying like young voters by 10 points. I mean, this makes no sense. They'll come back home in the end. This is like, these are samples that aren't representative of the voters who are eventually going to show up, or just bad samples, and we will recover. And it turned out that the signals contained in the polling data were absolutely correct. I mean, the Democrats did dramatically underperform among a lot of their key constituencies, and that did, hurt them quite a bit. And they weren't able to make that up with stellar performance among, say, white college-educated voters. That did not turn out to be the case. So, I think there was a lot of denialism about what the polls were telling us and the signals they were sending, which, to people's shock, turned out to be a real thing on election day. I mean, we're still counting the votes. There'll be more analysis, but it does look like what seemed like it might happen did happen, and that we're now in a little bit different political universe than we were before.
Let me ask you this question. There's no doubt it was a shellacking in many, many ways. The polls had it close.
Right.
I've heard the argument made that, like, actually, look, yes, it's bad because we lost, all 7 swing states, but but it was still a close election, right? So,
Sure.
in terms of the percentages, either in the swing states or even in most swing states or even nationally, do you feel like it was a close election, or do you think this was not a close election?
Well, it depends on your definition of close, I guess. It wasn't a landslide. I think that's pretty clear because of exactly the kinds of things you're alluding to, that despite taking all the 7 swing states, a lot of these margins were very modest. They're going to take the Senate, but not in as big a way as like the worst case scenarios. They're probably going to take the House, but it's going to be very tight. So it was another close election. It's just a close election in which everything went the other way. So, it's fair to say that this was at least as much an anti-democratic vote as a pro-Trump vote. And I think that's why people are looking at it as a realignment, I think, are getting a little bit ahead of the game, because I think that there are ingredients here for a realignment. John Judas and I have a piece coming out about this in the New York Times, in terms of, yes, the Democratic Party's in disarray. Yes, there's been a lot of pretty strong movement among key voter groups. But what really makes a realignment is keeping those voters there. The Republicans now have a lot of working class and non-white voters they didn't have before. Are those voters going to stick around? I mean, they'll only stick around, in my view, if actually the Republican administration delivers for them, if he makes those voters happy, if they feel like their lives get better, if they feel like whatever vision the Trump administration and Republicans have, it's their vision, and that lasts through 4 years. That's when you really could start talking about a realignment, which then we might see in the results of the 2028 election when J.D. Vance crushes Josh Shapiro or something, right? But I don't think I would be hesitant at this point to say, yes, this has been a realignment. It's been a very important election, and an election that's harbinger of a realignment. You could just as easily make the case it's just another close election, and we're still in basically 50-50 nation. I put out a long report with Yuval Levin at AEI called Politics Without Winners, where he made the case that over the last 20 or 30 years, basically we're in a politics without winners kind of era where no party is really the clear majority dominant party, and the other party has to basically deal with that. I mean, we've been seeing things toggle back and forth between the parties, and to some extent dependent on which party's negative aspects are most salient to voters. So I think probably we're still in that era, but I'm not ruling out that that could change over the course of this administration.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this upcoming administration, what you're expecting, but let's go back to something you said, which I think is super important, which is, this is pretty much a repudiation of what the Democrats were selling, is what I think I heard you say this time, or as much as a vote against Democrats as it was for Trump, potentially.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about why that is and what you're seeing as some of the disconnect, right? I mean, I feel like there's been a lot made for, a long time about Democratic policies are often more, appealing to broadly, but yet we still have this persistent problem of translating that into people voting for us. So, and then of course, there's a lot of policies that, probably people, or the way we talk about things maybe that people don't like. So just tell me a little bit about kind of what you're seeing as what you think the Democrats' biggest vulnerabilities were this time around, or have been, coming for many years now.
Right. Well, I'd say start with the economy, because that obviously was a huge issue in this election, maybe the biggest one. I think Democrats really were way too relaxed about inflation. They really did not take it seriously enough as something that might happen. And then once it did happen, they were inclined to dismiss it to some extent. It would be transitory until it wasn't. And I think related to that, the sort of perceived cost of living crisis on the part of ordinary voters, particularly working class voters, was something I think Democrats, until very, very late in the game, didn't realize how damaging it was going to be to them. And that voters associated that with the way Democrats had run economic policy. That it looked like maybe they kind of like overdid it on the spending money thing, that they were more, there's not only spending a lot of money, but they were spending on it things like fighting climate change, which people really didn't care about very much. And just a general perception that, yeah, maybe there's a few factories being built, but my life has not changed for the better. And that's really the fundamental thing that a party has to do. It has to change people's lives for the better, and people had to believe that it's changing their lives for the better. And they did not have that sense. They felt Democrats' priorities were skewed in this respect, and they blamed them for the bad things that happen in terms of cost of living, which, again, particularly working class people, is like a death knell. So that's one problem. The Democrats' policies, which they believed were setting the country on a course to broadly shared prosperity, were not perceived that way by voters. And I think that they had a hard time taking that on. It's kind of like, how many articles were written about you've never had it so good, right? Look at the last 2 years. Real wages are going up, the inflation coming down, everything's great. These people are just being misled by news coverage, by the media, by Fox News or whatever. And I think that that's never a good idea. If people don't like the economy, they don't like the economy. And it's silly to argue with them about it. Secondly, I think that in terms of more sociocultural issues, probably the biggest one here is immigration. That clearly the way the Biden administration handled immigration did result in a huge spike of illegal immigration. It just did. They relaxed the Trump rules at the border. Signals were sent that were duly received by migrants and the cartels that wanted to mobilize them as, okay, it's going to be a lot easier to get into the United States now. And once you get in, you can probably stay. And that was just true. So, people are rational. People want to come to the United States because it's a better place to be. And so they came. And only, again, very late in the game did Democrats realize that voters' concern about this is not just because they hate immigrants and they hate brown people or they're xenophobic. It's actually like a real problem that people believe the border should be controlled, and they don't think anybody should just be able to stroll across the border and wind up in the United States because they claim asylum or what have you. And some communities definitely did react negatively to having clusters of immigrants all of a sudden show up in their towns, and these were burdens on services and so on. So the inability to see that problem as a problem, instead see it as just the bad people in America don't like immigrants, I think was a killer. And I think the same thing was true about crime, that people's concerns about rising crime were initially dismissed as, it was just COVID. And besides, when you enforce the law, it has disparate impact. There were a lot of really toxic ideas about crime and about law enforcement and about the police, which, of course, were summarized in the 3 dumbest words in the English language, as James Carville put it, defund the police. Democrats really never got over that one. They are associated with being soft on crime. They are associated with caring more about the criminals than the victims. And again, this is a killer with ordinary voters, and is very much connected to the cultural left turn in the party where, things like strict border enforcement and putting criminals in jail and law and order were associated with, basically a sort of racist, xenophobic approach to, to sort of the country and to black and brown people and all this. And this was a tragic error. And people saw a lot of this concern on the part of Democrats about race, racial issues, about border issues, and of course, eventually about gender issues, which turned out to be a bigger issue in this election than people thought. It just really made it easy to characterize the Democrats as being out of the mainstream and caring about things ordinary people didn't care about. As the immortal line in the commercial goes, Biden, Harris cares about they, them. Trump cares about you. That was a very effective ad. And Democrats strenuously denied that issue would ever hurt them. And even when it happened, they were denying it would have any effect. But it just encapsulated for a lot of voters that Democrats are way out over their skis on a lot of these issues. And they do not, in fact, represent them. They do not, in fact, share their values. And Democrats have a lot of work to do, I think, in terms of correcting some of those problems and moving back toward the center, and so where their priorities and values are more recognizably those of ordinary Americans. So that's the way I see it. I think all of those things together really undercut the Democrats' pitch as being, we're the party of ordinary people. We are the party of the working class. And the working class said, oh, yeah? I don't think so. I'm going to vote for this guy, Trump.
Yeah. I mean, how much of it do you think is about in some of those, and particularly some of the cultural issues, do you think about is not only what you said, but also about how Democrats talk about things, right? We tend to divide up the electorate and say, oh, you're a white, middle-aged woman, right? You're a this, you're a that. And let me tell you what I'm going to do for you. And this concept, I mean, we worked in and around the Democratic Leadership Council back in the 80s and 90s. And, we talked a lot back then, essentially, right, about this idea of identity politics. And that even if you have a set of policies or agenda or values that are connecting, it doesn't help you when you kind of divide up the electorate that way and think about it that way, as opposed to kind of making a general appeal on those values and principles that can unite people. How much do you think that's at play here?
Oh, I think very much so. I think a lot of the issues I was just talking about are related to the overall identity politics framework, which is sometimes referred to as intersectional ideology, where there's the oppressors and the oppressed and the marginalized and the dominant. And basically we can slot people into these identity categories, which we then evaluate on the basis of that kind of framework. But everybody's in an identity category, and that's how we should think about them, which is a terrible idea. People hate this. Ordinary Americans hate this. What Americans believe in more than anything else is like, we're all equal. We should all have equal opportunity. There should be fairness. There should be no discrimination. And people should be rewarded on the basis of their merit, not on the basis of characteristics they can't change. And Democrats really seem like they were getting away from that. And they were thinking about people not as individuals who wanted to get ahead in the world or whatever, and instead thinking of them as, they're a black person or a queer person or this person or that person. I think that is in some ways fundamentally un-American. And I think that really produced a backlash against the Democrats. And I think one thing people liked about Trump is he's like, basically he said, I think all those categories are bullshit, And really, yeah, I think so too, including a lot of obviously people who are supposed to be in these marginalized groups. So, I think a big error. And I think it's been gathering force over the course of the 21st century, but really takes off in the teens and then toward the late teens. And of course, George Floyd summer and so on. I mean, I think the ideology, call it social justice ideology, call it wokeness, call it whatever you want, it kind of crested a little bit, I think maybe in 2020, 2021, but it's still with us, and it still brands the Democratic Party in a way that is very counterproductive for their interests. And we'll see what happens in this aftermath of this election, whether there is a strong move to the center on these issues. But I suspect it'll be it won't happen all at once, and there'll be a lot of debate about it. And that's fine. I guess there should be a lot of debate, but I'm just worried it'll get caught up in endless recriminations and sort of failure to see the basic truth that that's kind of what we need to do. And we can argue about how to do it, but we do need to do it. But I think there'll be resistance even to that.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing that in some of these postmortems.
Yeah. So on the flip side, to play devil's advocate, so I mean, I agree with you, what you're saying about kind of how we talk about people in identity politics. But at the same time, I mean, I also think Americans are generally kind, generally believe that we should, take care of our neighbor and love one another, and we're a sense of community. And Trump is an anathema to all of that, right? Trump is, not just saying, hey, we're all in this together. He's picking out people and making fun of them, literally, and picking out people and, and demonizing them. And so, is really not a uniter.
I just think there's a lot of people don't see it that way. When he talks about illegal immigrants, people say, that's right, they are illegal. I mean, and they see a Democratic Party that won't even use the word illegal. So, yes, he will make political hay out of some of these issues. And he's obviously, he's a huge exaggerator. Eli Lake wrote an interesting thing for the Free Press where he says, the important thing to understand about Trump is he's not a liar or a fascist. He's a bullshit artist, right? And people look about a lot of this stuff and they say, ha! What a bullshitter, I mean, he just exaggerates everything. And so people don't think about it as demonizing. They think about it as Trump's shtick, right? And I think the people who are most sensitive to thinking that this amounts to demonization, this amounts to, this appalling targeting of the disadvantaged are, essentially liberal educated people who basically are loyal Democrats. I mean, to them, it's horrific. But I think we have to realize that for a lot of people out there, it just doesn't land the same way. They see it as common sense. We shouldn't let a lot of illegal immigrants in the country, to continue on that one. And if they commit crimes, that's really bad. And they probably are, like a burden on a lot of communities. And, maybe they're not eating cats and dogs, but I get what he's saying, right? I get what he's saying. So I think we just have to live with that. We have to understand that characterizing Trump as simply someone who demonizes people and who's a borderline fascist did not work, and it will not work.
Okay, but I want to stay on this for 1 second. I think that's super interesting. Okay. But because and you and I actually met for coffee a while ago and had this conversation well before this election about democracy and how democracy was going to play out in this election. And right. I was. So I hear what you're saying. January 6th did happen, right? That's not an exaggeration. January 6th happened. And so, I think a lot of people, and probably including myself, thought democracy was going to be a really salient issue here. That people understood that, there's the rule of law, democracy, you got a convicted felon here, right? Again, I'm just trying to understand, right? So, I think a lot of people thought that was going to be a deal breaker for folks. We saw in the 2022 elections, a lot of election deniers at the state and local level lose. And I think people took learn from that lesson that maybe this was a really salient issue. Again, clearly wasn't, because people voted for him anyway. What is your take on that piece of it?
Yeah, I do think that the people did misinterpret the results of the 2022 election. It wasn't just they were election deniers, some of these candidates who lost. They were we're really terrible candidates, They weren't even replacement level Republican candidates. So they were pretty easy for halfway sensible Democrats to beat. And also, these are the kinds of elections where the nature of the Democratic coalition today is such that the lower the turnout, the better off they are, because Democrats have the most educated and engaged voters who will show up to vote for dog catchers. So this was misinterpreted as meaning that since the Republicans are tarred with the brush of election denialism, and Trump, of course, is the election denier in chief, this would eventually sink him. This man is an enemy of democracy, and we just have to keep pointing that out and pointing it out and pointing it out, and that should be sufficient. And it turns out that wasn't true. People aren't that scared of Trump as an anti-Democrat. In fact, if you look at the data, there's tons of people who are concerned about democracy or more concerned about the Democrats than the Republicans, because they see them as, people who are trying to regulate their speech, people who will go after their political opponents with court cases like they did with Trump. You may call him a convicted felon, but I think for most people, they don't even understand what he's convicted of. And it's like water off a duck's back. They don't get it. They don't understand why are there these millions of court cases against Donald Trump when he's running for president. Democrats may say, oh, well, because he's so awful, so guilty. But I don't think that's the way ordinary working class voters process this issue, as opposed to the way, say, you or I might process it. And in terms of January 6th, I mean, this obviously looms large in the consciousness of a lot of people in and around the Democratic Party, including its most active members. But for ordinary people, it's a while ago, and they never really thought about it in the way that a lot of people in the Democratic Party thought of it, as like sort of a plot to overthrow the government. It was more like, what a mess. It's a riot. What was people doing there? That's stupid. And I don't think they really processed it as an organized attempt to overthrow the United States through a coup. And because they don't process it that way, and because time has gone by, and because, despite the fact that all this mishigas happened, he still left office. And when he was president for 4 years, we did not exactly descend into fascism. And I think for a lot of people, it's like, I think the Democrats are kind of obsessed with this, right? I mean, it's like, to me, that's not my most important issue. My most important issue is the cost of living. My most important issue is these other issues I care about. Democrats talk endlessly about democracy, but I don't really think they're that democratic either. So screw them.
And the fact that there were Republicans like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and a whole boatload of people, including,
Yeah, but people don't care about them. The Cheneys? Are you kidding me? I mean, rolling out these like Republicans, who are, to the extent people know about them, they probably don't even like them, to convince working class people that, they should think Trump's a fascist and care. I think this was like crazy.
Yeah.
That's not how you reach median, sort of persuadable working class voters, is by rolling out Liz Cheney. I think the theory of that was they were going to get a lot more, Republican leaning, suburban educated voters. That didn't turn out to be true either.
Yeah.
But I think this was not how you make that issue salient to voters who aren't dialed in the way we are to some of this stuff, and either don't know who Liz Cheney is or the Cheneys. To the extent they do, they might not even like them. So, I think this was, again, flailing around, trying to come up with a magic bullet that would finally make this strategy work, whereas the problem was the strategy wasn't very good.
So what do Democrats do going forward to reach working class voters?
Well, I think that's something there should be a robust debate about. But I do think they need to move to the center on all the cultural issues that I've alluded to. I think they need to rejigger their economic agenda so that it does have something to say about the cost of living issue, about, sort of, I guess one way I think about it, I think there's this whole abundance movement that is taken root in parts of in and around the Democratic Party. I think that's important. I think that's what people are really interested in. They're really interested in more, better stuff. And they're not that interested in climate change as an issue. They're interested in cheap, reliable, and abundant energy. I think probably the quicker Democrats give up on trying to restructure the economy around renewables, the better off they'll be. And they should think more vigorously and more in depth about how they actually move the sort of a democratic economic program in the direction of something that would produce fast, relatively equally distributed growth. Which probably means if you want fast growth, you want the country to do stuff. I mean, clearly there's huge problems now with permitting and regulatory bottlenecks that make it so hard to do stuff. Maybe some of these regulations were a good idea to begin with, but they're not good ideas anymore. I mean, the whole NEPA thing, regs from the 70s are a terrible idea. Democrats should be more pro-nuclear. They're already moving in that direction. I mean, this is just a very broad sketch, I think, of the things they need to start thinking about, and how you put it all together into a policy approach that voters understand, I think is part of why they pay people the big bucks. And, I'm not a campaign consultant, and I'm not a, sort of policy maven, but I do think that whatever the Democrats' image on economic issues has to be changed and has to be more oriented toward growth and prosperity and less oriented toward handing stuff out.
Yeah, no, I think that makes some sense. we talked a little bit about the Trump first administration, or the second, I guess, this next 4 years. What do you think is the likelihood that he's going to be able to deliver on some of those promises, particularly on the economy?
I think that's the big question, and that'll determine whether we really have a realignment or not. I mean, you look at the things that have been said, that there's sort of economicsy in the Trump program, and it's really hard to see it as a coherent approach to the kinds of things that I was recommending the Democrats do, right? I mean, how are they going to produce, dynamic economic growth and rising prosperity and a widely shared sense of upward mobility? They may be able to do it, but it's hard to see how this kind of weird combination of high tariffs and some industrial policy and tax cuts and not taxing. So, I mean, it's a mess. And so if they try to implement that mess, and it is a mess, then I think that, there may well be a Democratic comeback just based on anti-incumbent feelings. But if they're able to make a silk purse out of that sow's ear and deliver for people and have an economic program that has some center to it, that people kind of get what they're doing and it actually works. I mean, J.D. Vance, it's like, he is a policy guy. Trump is not. We'll see how much influence he has in the administration. And so far, they've been doing a pretty good job, I think, selecting, reasonably competent people for some of these big posts. We'll see what happens with that down the line. But, I mean, who knows? We may be shocked, and the Trump administration will actually wind up being competent and actually doing stuff that people like. It could happen. And then Democrats really do have to take really seriously the idea of competing with a party that is not as shambolic as they thought. I mean, in a way, their whole card in all this is Donald J. Trump, because there may be a lot of sensible people in his administration. J.D. Vance may have some interesting ideas, but Trump is Trump, and he's the guy at the top, and you just don't know what he's going to. We really don't know what he's going to do or say, and what's going to be his priorities. So, I mean, it's all to play for. And that's why I think Democrats, if they really realize the need to rebrand the party, to have a really different approach, to, sort of not go back to the future and not sort of just wait for the Trump people to screw up, I think they can potentially move forward in a way that would be very productive for them. But I think it's contingent on not being lazy bones and just hoping the Trump people screw up. You've got to have your own offer to make to the American people that rectifies some of your previous problems, and the fact that most working class people don't like the Democrats anymore. I mean, just repeat that to yourself 1,000 times, and that should concentrate the mind.
It's a little, I totally agree with you that we have to stand for something. We can't be against. So I think there is a lot of soul searching to do. And my final question for you, I'm excited that you've got a new book coming out, I think.
It came out.
Oh, it came out. Okay, good. Right. Is it just out now?
Well, no, it came out a year ago. That's the funny thing about it. A lot of the things we've been talking about and a lot of the things we just saw in this election were prefigured by our analysis with my co-author, John Judas, in that book. But because it came out when it did, there was October 7th. There was the fact Democrats still thought they could, they're coming off 2022, 2023, and they thought they kind of solved their problems. It didn't get nearly as much attention as I think it should have, in all due modesty. But it's now out there, and I urge people to take a look at it, because I think it tells a story that really makes sense out of what just happened. And I think that's what everybody's trying to figure out.
Yeah, well, I think then let's put a plug in for that. It's called Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremism, correct?
Correct.
So people, I think that will be I am sure that you are going to see sales go up on that one, because it's the question, right, of what happened and where do we go from here? So,
exactly.
Ruy, thanks so much for taking the time today. That was a really a lot to chew on, I think, for all of us. And we're going to be in this time of thinking about what happened and where we go from here. So this was a really important part of that conversation. I appreciate you taking the time.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And everyone out there, keep thinking, because Lord knows we need it.
Great to see you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, No tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,